Oh, there's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Sean the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a special edition of In Other Words, and this is vocabulary that I have encountered in my Victober reading. As I think you all know, Victober is a month-long celebration and readathon devoted to Victorian literature, and there's some great words, phrases, idioms, and grammatical patterns to be found in said Victorian literature. And I hope this is the first of two installments of, in other words, devoted to the reading I have been doing for Victober. I want to get this one up during Victober. The other one I'm hoping to film before the end of Victober, and I'm not sure when it will get posted. For those of you that don't know, In Other Words is an occasional series in which I talk about vocabulary and so on that I encounter in my reading. Not because I'm an expert, not because I'm an English teacher, not because I have a master's degree in English Lit, but I just love geeking out and going down grammatical and semantic rabbit holes online to bring what I learn about these phrases and words to you. All right, so let's get started. The first couple are from, and many of these are novels that I'm still reading. I haven't finished reading, but the first couple are from the Anthony Trollope novel Phineas Finn, the second in his series of novels, the Palliser novels. The first word I have for you is snub. The doctor certainly did not snub his son, so his son is the protagonist, Phineas Finn, and I thought, fathers typically don't snub sons, so this must be a different spin on the word snub. The most common meaning, the meaning that we all know, is to disdainfully ignore someone, to refuse to communicate with, acknowledge someone. But actually, the meaning in this sentence harkens back to the Middle English meaning, which means to rebuke with sharp words. So not to cut off communication, but to scold sharply, to castigate. So I didn't know that meaning. And it comes from the Old Norse snubba, which meant to chide. And in English, the verb to snub dates from the 14th century. To curse, to chide, to scold, to reprove. The original sense was to cut off. And they think etymologically it's related to snip, 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 which is how we use it in the modern sense. But from the 15th century onwards, it had both the meaning of to rebuke, the way it's used in Trollope here, and also to intentionally slight, which is the meaning that I knew. Another one from Trollope, from Phineas Finn, is to quail. Lady Laura's eyes were described as being large and bright and very clear, and they never seemed to quail. And a quail, I know that there's a bird or something called quail, and this meaning of quail, as far as the etymologists have it, has no bearing on that animal meaning, but it means to feel or show fear or apprehension. She quailed at his heartless words. So Lady Laura's eyes never showed any fear or apprehension. This meaning of quail goes back to the late Middle English period, in the sense of wasting away, coming to nothing. But the truth is, nobody knows exactly how it came to mean this shrinking back in fear or showing apprehension. So I'll leave it at that, because nobody's really sure. Probably the most interesting one for me so far in Trollope is the political historical phenomenon called the Chiltern Hundreds, which continues to this day. I can't believe it. Phineas Finn is elected to Parliament. He was elected from Ireland to the Parliament in London, and he gets cold feet soon after he arrives. I'm not spoiling anything, and considers resigning. Well, in the mid-19th century and in the early 21st century, it is impossible. It is illegal for a member of Parliament to resign. And that dates back to ancient times. I didn't do as deep a dive as I could have, but enough to tell you about this weird historical political phenomenon in the UK. So, you were not allowed to resign. You could be booted out of office in the next election. You could die. You could be somehow otherwise expelled or disqualified. But you could not, of your own volition, resign. So, there is this ancient administrative area in Buckinghamshire called the Chiltern Hundreds. What are hundreds? A hundred was, I don't know if it still is, I'm assuming that that's all changed, but this weird thing still exists in the political culture. A hundred was a traditional division of an English county. Nobody knows why anymore, but that's what. The Chiltern Hundreds was an ancient administrative area in Buckinghamshire, composed of 3 of those hundreds. I can tell you the names, but it would just make your eyes glaze over. But they do have names. Going way, way back, the other rule that dates from ancient times to the present in British political culture is you cannot hold a paid office of the Crown and be an MP. So then and up to and including now, maybe we might pray that Boris Johnson takes this route out. If you want to resign, and you can't resign, you instead apply for a paid office of the Crown in the Chiltern Hundreds, and then you are expelled because you have broken the rules. It's the only legal way to resign. And that was true in the mid-19th century in the UK, and according to the internet, according to Wikipedia and Parliament.uk, I will put those links if you don't believe me, because it's hard to accept that this is still true. That is the law. Now, I'm only about 22% into Phineas Finn, the novel, so I am curious about the fact that one of the minor characters, and I am assuming he will become more and more important as the novel progresses, his title is Lord Chiltern. And these are the Chiltern Hundreds, so let's see as I continue to read what that's all about. But wow. All right, let's move on to a novel that I didn't enjoy very much, but I did read for Victober, a writer of books by George Paston, the pseudonym of Emily Morse Simons, and it was written at the end of the 19th century. A few words and phrases from that. The protagonist's father has died when she is a young adult, and she didn't have a particularly close relationship with her father, but he did provide for her especially intellectual stimulation because he had a for-profit lending library that she lived in. And so we are told that thanks to her father, the protagonist never had to raise the bitter cry of so many of her sex. Quote, "We have no share in the roses of Pieria." I had no idea what that was about. It goes back to Greek mythology. I'm not a big mythological devotee, but anyway, in Greek mythology, the Pierian spring of Macedonia was sacred to the Muses and conceived of as the metaphorical source of knowledge of art and science. Pope referred to it in his poem An Essay on Criticism. And the first line of the couplet is very familiar to me and probably to many of you. A little learning is a dangerous thing. The next line, drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. But why roses? Pierian roses were the roses that grew on Mount Olympus. So it's just part of the same extended metaphor. That's enough about that. Peccavi is an exclamation used to express one's guilt. In the modern idiom, we might say, my bad. But in the 19th century, they said Peccavi. Why did they say Peccavi? It comes from Latin and came into English in the mid-16th century, meaning I have sinned. There was a Latin verb, peccare, meaning to sin. Peccavimus, we have sinned. Peccavit, he has sinned. And the other word that it's not that common anymore that has come into English, I think probably via Italian, which would make sense, is peccadillo, a noun meaning a small sin, and that comes from the same Latin root, a relatively minor fault or sin, of which I have several. There's a bit of debate among etymologists, but some think it goes back to the Proto-Indo-European root ped, meaning foot, walk, stumble, impair, but nobody can agree. The next batch come from a novel that I am not even quite in the middle of, but I'm absolutely loving, George Gissing's The Odd Women, which was 1893. Somebody is referred to as a swell. And I think I'd heard it before, but I didn't know what it meant. It's a dated informal noun meaning a fashionable, stylish person of wealth or high social position. Everybody knows swell means a morbid enlargement of some part of the body or something. Or the sea swells, a rising of a body of water. The meaning here of a wealthy, elegant person dates from 1786, and that is connected to a now obsolete sense of swell, which was pompousness and arrogance, which goes back to 1724. And if you think about a swelled head, it's like that, or puffed up, an enlargement of the ego. But for a time, a swell didn't necessarily have the nuance of being arrogant, but it comes from the arrogant nuance from a half century before. So that's very interesting. And if we think about it further, a really dated slang word is, he's a swell guy, or that's swell. And that also, you can trace it etymologically back to that meaning, dating from the 1920s. It's found in P.G. Wodehouse in the 1930s, but it did flow out of that sense of stylish, distinguished, first-rate. So the somewhat more modern meaning of great or nice, pleasant, came straight out of that. Okay, the next one I went down a real rabbit hole on in a way that didn't necessarily pertain to the context of the quote, but two of the feminist main characters in the novel are talking about lower class British women, and it's one of the few things that is a little bit offensive to the modern reader in the novel so far, because one of them just dismisses the lower class women out of hand as saying, we can't be bothered with them, they're just beyond the pale, and refers to them as a ragged regiment. So the sense in which the phrase ragged regiment is used in that passage is a group of beggars, and that goes back to a play in the late 16th, early 17th century by the playwright and pamphleteer Thomas Dekker. So the woman is dismissing her lower class contemporaries as being just a group of beggars. And it's pejorative, and that's enough said about that. But then I went down a rabbit hole because it has another meaning that is much more interesting. That phrase, ragged regiment, was also given to a group of dilapidated, waxen effigies. We'll stop here to make sure everybody knows effigy. An effigy is a sculpture or model of a person, often in death, a tomb effigy. I'll put up a couple pictures here so you know what I'm talking about. And in the modern political meaning, it's a roughly made model of a person that is intended to be damaged or destroyed as a way of enacting political protest, burning George Bush in effigy. But this meaning is the older one, just any kind of a sculpture or model of a person. But the ragged regiment were these groups of deteriorating effigies of kings and queens of England and other historical personages. So back in the day, this term ragged regiment was ascribed to them sometime in the 19th century. But way back, having an effigy made of you to be used at your death It was placed on your coffin as it was carried in procession through the streets of London, and it was often displayed in Westminster Abbey or whatever cathedral or abbey until your tomb was ready. And then once it was no longer needed for those purposes, it was just kind of stuffed into a closet. But in the 19th century, and I'm going to put some links in here if you want to do a deep dive on this like I did, because it's absolutely fascinating. These haunting human portraits, these models of the famous dead people, kings, queens, whatever, which were in many ways the most accurate replica of what they looked like and featured their own clothes that they wore in their lifetime, they became exhibits that the cathedrals and abbeys would display for money for everyday people like you and me to come and look at, but they were not kept in very good condition, so they became known in the 19th century as the Ragged Regiment. And that's all I'm going to spend time telling you, but it's so interesting. So look at some of my links, and here's some pictures. I am looking at the time, and I want to keep this short. So this is going to be not as much vocabulary as I had originally intended. I had a handful of words from the Charlotte Mary Young novel, The Carbonels, but that will have to be for next time. The more interesting the words, the longer it takes to tell you about them. So I'm going to close with the verb decked, which is the last one I had for you today from the Gissing novel, The Odd Women. One of the main characters decked herself, which meant she got dressed up. And you're probably familiar with that meaning of decked. Decked out. We use it phrasally. The phrasal verb decked out in a tuxedo or whatever. You're gussied up, you're dressed up. This is fascinating. The meaning is to decorate or adorn brightly, festively. And the other verbal meaning of deck is to hit, to knock flat to the ground with a punch. If you don't stop that, I will deck you. Okay? So how do those two relate to each other, and how do they relate to the noun deck? My parents have a lovely deck on the side of their house. It's not a word you want to mispronounce if you're talking about a man's deck. But anyway, so deck, entered English in the late Middle period, comes from Dutch deck, D-E-C, meaning a covering, a roof, a cloak, and the verb meant to cover. So you can maybe already see how we get to the verb deck, meaning to adorn oneself, to clothe oneself festively, from cover, noun, deck. It originally referred to a canvas, which was used to make some kind of a covering, especially on a ship. Okay, so now if you're following me, many of you are probably thinking about the famous phrase, naval or nautical phrase, all hands on deck. So deck was the floor of the ship, the upper floor, is that the right word, floor? Later came to mean a solid surface, serving as roof and floor. From the mid-15th century, it was side-to-side cover of a ship, over part of a ship. And it actually goes back to a Proto-Germanic word, thacum, from which we get the word thatch, thatched roof. Oh, this is so interesting. Ultimately going back to the Proto-Indo-European root. It's the only one I'm going to talk about in any detail here because it's so interesting. Teg or steg, which meant to cover. How about a deck of cards? They think that's from the late 16th century, and it's pretty much only speculation that the deck was stacked like the decks of a ship. I think that's a bit of a stretch, but whatever. Tape deck from 1949 refers to the flat surface of the old reel-to-reel tape recorders. Deck chair, used on the deck of an ocean liner. On deck, you're ready for duty on the ship. Deck the halls with boughs of holly, fa-la-la-la-la. Okay. Adorn, decorate. So how about the deck meaning of punch? Originally, it didn't really take on that meaning until the mid-1950s, but the idea came from one sailor punching another sailor and knocking him down on the deck of the ship. The Proto-Indo-European root steg or teg. Here are some other words that come from that. Deckle, deckled ages. Detect, on cover. Protect, cover as in protect. Tile, all come from the same root. All right, so I had more, but I've gone on for long enough, so I've already a ways into preparing the second installment of the Victober, in other words. Stay tuned for that. It may not come out until November, but this was fun. Thanks for watching.